The war in Yemen has raged for more than 4 years, but in the face of almost daily airstrikes, rebel forces have not only survived, but thrived. How? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmakers are the Houthis. With no end in sight, fighting in Yemen has entered a 5th year. The war began when the Houthi militia moved on the capital Sana'a at the end of 2014. They soon also took the port city of Hodeidah. 6 months later, a coalition led by Saudi Arabia began a bombing campaign. Now, tens of thousands of people have been killed, and millions now face famine and disease in the Arab world's poorest country. The Houthis are said to rely on help from Iran, but the coalition opposing them has more wealth and far more firepower. Despite that, the Houthis are defiant and still control large swathes of territory in the north. So, how did what started as a theological movement turn into a force that rules much of Yemen? That debate in a moment, but first, here's Randolph Nogel.
Four years after they took the capital Sana'a, the Houthis' resolve to keep fighting appears to be unshakable.
ولا يمكن أبداً أن نرجع تحت الوصاية الأمريكية أو السعودية.
They've been called rebels since they forced Yemeni President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi from power in 2015. But through 4 years of airstrikes by a Saudi-led coalition, the Houthis have not just survived, they've become administrators. They've appointed district supervisors to provide security and mobilize recruits for the ongoing war. The Houthis come from the north of Yemen, they're Shia, and it's widely believed they're supported by Iran, even though Tehran denies it. Fighters loyal to Hadi control parts of the east and south. Al-Qaeda has a presence in the southwest, and the Houthis control most of the west. Other than Sana'a, the most important point of control is Hodeidah, a port on the Red Sea, where 70% of all imported goods enter the country, including vital humanitarian aid.
It remains catastrophic. More than 24 million people now need humanitarian assistance. That's 80% of the population. They include 10 million people just a step away from famine.
As the war has raged on, there's been plenty of blame to go around.
ارتكبت جميع أطراف النزاع المستمر في اليمن جرائم حرب وانتهاكات جسيمة للقانون الدولي الإنساني.
Airstrikes from the Saudi-led coalition aren't the only source of terror civilians face.
نزحنا من حالة الحرب، هجموا علينا من هنا الحوثة ومن هنا العدوان.
هناك أكثر من أطفال وأسر ضحايا الألغام. هذا إحدى الطفل وهو تعرض لإصابة، شوف بتر أصابعه نتيجة ألغام.
But it's a lack of access to food that's probably brought the most hardship.
The Stockholm Agreement, which is the only path to peace, could be dead within a matter of weeks if we don't see a real progress in clearing the port of Hodeidah from militia, from troops.
Hodeidah is crucial to holding off a famine in Yemen. But it's unclear whether international pressure will be enough to break the deadlock on an agreement to clear Hodeidah so that aid can get through.
We're greatly frustrated by what we see as delays and stalling on the part of the Houthis in implementing what they agreed to in Sweden.
But with every airstrike carried out by the Saudi-led coalition comes a potential recruiting opportunity for the Houthis, all fueling a cycle of violence and vengeance. With no victory in sight for either side, a grisly status quo begs the question: if the Houthis have only consolidated power through war, do they possess the political will to make peace? Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel now. Joining me now from Sana'a is pro-Houthi journalist Hussein El-Bukhaiti. In Chamonix, France, is Elizabeth Kendall. She's a senior research fellow in Oriental Studies at Oxford University and has been involved in educational projects in Yemen. And Fatima Abul Asrar is a senior analyst for the Arabia Foundation, a pro-Saudi think tank based in Washington, D.C. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Elizabeth Kendall, let me start with you. More than 4 years on, how have the Houthis managed to survive and become a de facto state in much of Yemen?
They have managed to become a de facto state, although I would argue that it's not one that functions very well. Of course, the Houthis came to power in 2014 originally on an anti-corruption ticket, and that message resonated much more broadly than their usual base. So they were able to get greater support than anyone expected in Sana'a and then eventually in surrounding areas. But one must remember that their military capability came largely from the Yemeni military itself. About 2/3 of the Yemeni military and personnel went over to the Houthis with the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Right.
But I would argue that there's another way of asking that question, which would be, why have the Saudis failed over the last 4 years, given their superior military capability? And I think that has to come down partly to incompetence. After about 20,000 airstrikes, probably around 1/3 of them have hit civilian targets. And they are the Yemeni military cobbled together from a whole host of different factions, tribes, groups. So it really has been very difficult for them to hold up against these seasoned warriors, the Houthis.
So let me ask you, Fatima, without infusing a moral judgment on this, in terms of military capability, it's David versus Goliath, right? Yet Goliath, with all this military firepower, has failed, as we heard from Elizabeth. Why?
You know, for all of their power, the Saudis are a mismatch in this war with the Houthis. The Houthis use asymmetrical warfare against a conventional army. That is not something that is bound to succeed. The Houthis have been particularly good at this since 2004. So it has been 6 rounds of war with the Yemeni government, and with it, the Houthis they were able to largely survive. And then at the same time, what we see at the moment is that they're surviving because it is a low-cost war for them, and survival is really the core of what they need to do. They're particularly good at this, and I think an army, a big army, I mean, no matter how big it is, won't be able to squash a rebellion as such. I mean, we're seeing it in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, for example.
Okay, but help me understand, Fatima. Sorry to interrupt you. Help me understand. When you say asymmetrical warfare, what do you mean exactly? Give me an example of a tactic that the Houthis use that makes it difficult for the Saudi-led coalition.
I mean, the Houthis maintain their strength from being in heavily populated areas that you cannot really do any type of carpet bombings there. The Saudis are definitely at a mismatch because what they're doing is they're relying on an aerial strategy that have absolutely failed. Not here. And, not going to say that this is, it's failing. And I think, we fail to understand what the Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is not really there to fight or eliminate the Houthis, or even as they state that they want to upend the Houthis' rule. What they're doing is primarily protecting their borders from the Houthis. So they're going after large targets. And the Houthis survive because they want to, through prolonging this war, frankly. So I think, both have different objectives. The Saudis want to, currently the majority of their operations are around the Sada, the Sada border with Saudi Arabia, where they're trying to implement a buffer zone at that time. And what they want to do is really strike at the large ballistic missile capabilities of the Houthis. So that is, for the Saudis, the primary objective. And everything else comes secondary. And the Houthis, particularly survive because they're deeply entrenched in heavily populated areas that cannot be extracted from.
Okay, I want to follow up with that, but I want to go to Hussein. Hussein, I'll come back to you, Fatima. Hussein, let me ask you, is that at the heart of it all? For the Houthis, they just need to survive for it to be considered winning, whereas the Saudis want absolute victory, and therefore, until they have that, they're always going to have failed.
No, I don't think that the Houthi, as you said, they just, for them to survive, to win. And we've seen that the Houthi have conducted many attacks on the Saudi border, and they tried to gain many territory in south of Saudi Arabia. And I think it's all because that the Saudi-led coalition has actually got it wrong, because they have exaggerated, if we can say lied about the strength of the Houthi by saying that is fully supported from Iran. And after the blockade, we've seen that the Houthi actually mainly depend on the weapons they have from the Yemeni army. And the Houthi now, and I believe that in this year, they still have many weapons and many targets in Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And the Saudi till now, they have used all their power. They haven't got anything new. And the more Saudi airstrike and destruction of civilian target like schools and any other area, this actually get more support to the Houthi movement, because there is this kind of hatred in Yemen against Saudi Arabia in general and against the Gulf country, and as well against the United States and Britain, and especially their stand toward the occupation of Palestine. And for the Houthi to fight all these groups and those countries defending Yemen, I think this is one of the good examples that Yemeni actually try to follow.
Okay, and Hussein, let me then ask you, we know that the Saudi airstrikes have been responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. This has been well documented. On the other hand, we just had news coming in recently, the World Food Programme, saying that the Houthis are denying them access to grain storage at Hodeidah, and therefore they can't distribute this to the people. And we also have had credible reports from Human Rights Watch, for example, in the past, showing that the Houthis are not afraid to also play very ugly in this war. They torture people. They beat people up. They do all sorts of people disappear under their watch, right? At what point do the Houthis just become, or have they always been, just a massive group of thugs who want to stay in control for as long as possible?
If we see that the Houthi are in control of about 70% of the population of Yemen, is most of the population in Houthis area. And if they were, as some people might call them, thugs or militia, I don't think they can actually continue to rule Yemen despite all this war against them.
Certainly,
and
but
the blockade and the constant
guns, right?
attack from Saudi.
They haven't put down their weapons. They're holding guns. I mean, we haven't asked those 70% of the population how they feel about it. We don't have a poll of it, right?
Of course, I mean, if you see in Yemen, I mean, everyone is holding a gun. But who is the Houthi fighting? If the Houthi were not fighting Saudi Arabia, which is backed from the United States, if the fight maybe was only a civil war, as some people might describe, maybe we will see a different picture. And about the World Food Program, there was an agreement between both sides that they will withdraw from the road, so those workers can reach this so-called Red Sea mills. But as soon as the Houthi opened the road, the Saudi-backed forces fire has targeted, and snipers has killed one of the Houthi fighter in that area. That's why all this agreement has collapsed. And of course, you might see some wrong things that has been done by the Houthi here or there. But I mean, this can happen. But if you compare it with Aden and the security situation in Aden, the Houthi are much better than what's happening in Aden, and this gives them more support.
So Fatima, comparatively, the Houthis cannot compare to the alleged war crimes committed by the coalition. Respond to that.
It's a different ballgame here, and you know, the Houthis have committed egregious violations on the ground. The only thing is that they're not highlighted because they're seen as really primarily local. I think a few weeks ago you interviewed a colleague of mine who was talking about the Hajur and the tribes of Hajur in Hajjah, the northern areas, where the Houthis brutally squash them for merely, wanting to violate their lands and for those tribes wanting to defend themselves. We have seen, the atrocities in Hajur have been largely unsupported. There has been shelling, there has been a ballistic missile sent towards them, 3,000 people were displaced, and all of that doesn't even make the news. You can tell me that it doesn't compare when, at the beginning of the war in 2015, the Houthi and Saleh army desecrated the south of Yemen in Aden and in Abyan and other areas. Thousands of lives, over 4,000 deaths in less than 6 months of guerrilla warfare and fighting. You know, thousands of people are dying, and it's not a joke. So if we're going to talk about this as a statistic of who's doing what bad, the Saudis are not doing good either. You know, we're not. I think you made a mistake there by identifying me as a pro-Saudi think tank. We have a Saudi founder, but we have to understand we're not here to say that
your funding comes from private Saudi funders, and I have yet to ever come across your organization openly criticize Saudi Arabia on any issue, from Khashoggi to anything else. So we have to be accurate as well for the viewer to place things in the right context.
No, wait,
right?
you can be, I am sorry, I disagree with you there. You know, as a person who works in this foundation, I have criticized the murder of Khashoggi. I have criticized, you know, the treatment of the women activists. I have been very vocal and open about that, and have criticized the Saudi mistakes in Yemen. So I really, truly don't appreciate the way that this has been framed. And our founder
so for example,
has the right to express his views, and our funding is diversified. So I needed to correct that first.
For example, if we have the Heritage Foundation, we say right-wing think tank. If we have Think Progress or something like that, we'll say left-wing think tank. Because of the Saudi funding and because of your founder and your founder's positions, we made an editorial decision to say pro-Saudi. Although it is encouraging to hear that you criticize Saudi Arabia, and we appreciate that. And none of this is going to be edited as well. So, Fatima, please, this is all, all on the table, and we appreciate it. Elizabeth, let me bring you in here. Now, you've heard the differing perspectives as to who's more to blame here. And where we are right now in 2019, the place is an absolute mess. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. In Stockholm, there seemed to be a semblance of optimism moving forward, but that hasn't translated on the ground. Why?
Well, Imran, first of all, I think you've done a very good job of bringing out the fact that there are no obvious good guys in this war. On the one hand, the Saudi bombardment has generated a lot of criticism, especially when it's poorly targeted. And on the other hand, the Houthis have not been brilliant at governing and have also clamped down very heavily on any dissent. If only Stockholm could work. Why is it not working? Well, there were three main elements to it. There was the Hudaydah ceasefire, there was the Ta'iz understanding, and there was the prisoner swap. None of them have come to pass yet. And that's largely because the detail in that Stockholm agreement that was now signed almost 4 months ago was so thin. It was lacking in any of the specifics, and so it's very difficult to interpret on the ground. Both sides, for example, wish to consider the local forces, who were supposed to take over Hudaydah, to be their own forces. And as for the Ta'iz understanding, in fact, fighting has escalated again there. We're no closer to peace, and the prisoners have not yet been swapped. I think what's happened is that after 4 years of war, both sides are incredibly polarized. The views are entrenched, and it's really hard for them to foresee a future where they might have a power-sharing government. And so we have to hope that the United Nations Special Envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths, does keep persisting with his tireless and laudable efforts to bring these two sides to some kind of tangible acceptance of the Stockholm Agreement so that it can be rolled out properly on the ground.
Fatima, would the Saudi-led coalition and the Hadi government ever accept the Houthis governing along with them?
I think Elizabeth had just right now highlighted that the Houthis haven't particularly been good at governing. This is not their forte. They're good fighters, we'll give them that. But in terms of governing, they are not even able to allow the aid agencies deliver food supplies to the majority of the population. 60% of the aid, according to the World Food Program, has been diverted to Houthi militia as opposed to people who need it. So, they have a mission that is not necessarily governing the country of Yemen. It's empowering, Iran and Iranian strategy in the country. And we continue to be completely, just undermining that and not wanting to talk about it. So this has been very evident in the way that they're actually, all of the militia that they're using, it's expendable army, as long as they can maintain that power. And as long as they can maintain and prolong the war, as long as they can prolong the humanitarian crisis and cry about the blockade and the humanitarian suffering, the more that they gain a seat at the table.
Okay.
And the more that they are able to be, able to get the advantages that they got at Stockholm.
Okay.
And that's something that we continue being blindsided about.
Okay, so Hussein, just because the north of Yemen has a history of being largely inhabited by Zaidi Shias, it doesn't give the Houthis a God-given right to control the place. And as we heard from Fatima, they failed miserably as they've been governing. So stick to fighting. You shouldn't be involved in governing as Houthis. That's the word from Fatima. What do you think, Hussein?
I can say that the Houthi, the government is not functioning so well, and they are not maybe brilliant in like governing Yemen. This is not because they are bad. It's because of the blockade. Because 85% of Yemen income is in the hand of the Saudi-backed forces, is oil and gas, which is in Marib. A full blockade that have destroyed all airports and ports. So there is little little money for Yemeni government in Sana'a to fulfill everything in need for Yemeni civilians. But we have to say
for fighting,
that of course no one have the right. No one have the right to rule Yemen. As well, no one have the right to come and to attack a country, to form a blockade, to kill and injure hundreds of thousands of Yemeni civilians, to destroy a country. I mean, let's see, is the Houthi now, have they become weaker because of the war? No, they become more stronger because of this coalition, because of the killing of Yemeni civilians. And I want just to add one more thing about when Fatima have said about Hajur and that the Houthi has used ballistic missile. This is the type of lies that we only saw on Al Arabiya TV and Saudi TV. There was an agreement between Hajur and Houthi in 2013 so that the war will not reach that area and to leave the road safe. So what happened 3 months ago, Saudi loyalists in that area, Yemenis, have cut the road, have killed and kidnapped dozens of people, and the Saudi-backed forces has came with their fighter jet supporting those people. So those people were actually working with the Saudi. That's why the Houthi has to take a strong step to stop that, because this will cause
you're not disputing that it happened. You're just
Yemeni against Saudi Arabia.
You're not disputing that it happened. You're just justifying it. I mean, listen, we don't have time, and I'd love to continue.
No, it didn't happen. I said about the ballistic missile.
Okay.
She said ballistic is a big lie, but of course.
But then you still followed up with context as to why they would attack. Okay. Nevertheless, I'm out of time, Hussein. But listen, Hussein, Elizabeth, and Fatima, I'd love to have you all back on the program. It's a disgrace that we're still talking about this war raging 4 years on. And above all else, it's a humanitarian catastrophe, and we hope that it ends soon. I thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers, Hussein, Elizabeth, and Fatima. Still to come, should I stay or should I go? That's the question Syrian refugees in Jordan are asking themselves now that the border crossing has reopened. We have a special report on those choosing to return home. And thousands march in Colombia to protest the president's planned changes to a peace agreement with leftist rebels. Is this Ivan Duque's first step towards unravelling the peace accord? In 8 years of war, millions of Syrians have fled to neighboring countries. Most of those states are now pressing or helping those people to go back home. All this week, we've been looking at Jordan, which is home to an estimated 1.3 million refugees. Despite reopening the border with Syria late last year, only a few thousand have returned. Yola Abdavid went to the Jabr crossing in northern Jordan to ask those making the journey why they feel it's the right time to return.
Loaded up and returning home after 6 years in Jordan. This family wouldn't talk on camera, but said they're confident life is getting better in their hometown of Daraa in Syria. Travelling between the two countries is getting easier. Amani Kabatilo is from Damascus and has 2 children. She's travelling home after visiting her sister, a refugee in Jordan.
Businesses are opening again and manufacturing is restarting. Thank God the situation is becoming more stable.
Since October, the Jaber border crossing point has reopened, and it's mostly traders and truckers which are using this route into southern Syria. Some families are also returning to their homes in Syria and leaving Jordan, but from what we've seen, only a very few are doing that. Further down the line, we found another family of exiles, chancing to leave their refuge for 6 years and returning to Daraa, just 13 kilometers north of the border with Jordan.
I'm going to see my business and go back to work, and I want to see my family. For 6 years, I haven't seen my father or my mother. I want to see my family.
As the opening hours are extended at the checkpoints, there are regular cross-border bus services now. Jordanian and Syrian traders are regularly doing business on both sides of the border after Jaber was shut for 3 years.
I transport goods and sometimes passengers from Syria to Jordan and from Jordan to Syria. The situation is good, thank God. It's good, that's all I know, and the facilities are good.
But it's not good enough for the majority of Syrian refugees, and unlikely to attract as many as the government perhaps would like to see return in the short term.
We have a radio program called Syrians Amongst Us, and we're tracking every day. The return is very, very slow. Less than 2%, I think, have returned since they opened the borders. So we have a situation where people will not return as long as they are not finding safety, that they can have a home to go to, and a job. Without safety, a home and a job, why would somebody go back?
A few kilometers away, tens of thousands of Syrians have decided they aren't going anywhere yet. Satari is one of the world's largest refugee camps. Inside, I meet Ahmad, a 16-year-old student with big dreams.
After I finish study, I want to be a doctor. I will study medicine at university.
And do you want to study medicine in Jordan, or will you go back to Syria?
I'd rather to study here in Jordan because there is war in Syria.
You don't want to go back?
I hope I go back to my country if the war ended.
The Satari camp has a permanent air to it. There are schools, health clinics, youth clubs, police and soldiers to guard those inside. And there are 2 long, busy streets of shops and businesses. But it's the uncertainty and insecurity of what life in Syria now would feel like, which is keeping this family in Satari.
I left Syria because it was dangerous and there wasn't any medical treatment for my children. It was very difficult, and we've been in Zatari for 6 to 7 years now. We can't return because of the situation in Syria and no health care for my children. I don't have a home anymore.
More than 12,000 refugees out of an estimated 1.3 million have returned to Syria according to official statistics. Offering a temporary home to so many means Jordan's government has struggled to curb public debt of $40 billion. That's equivalent to 95% of its gross domestic product. On Satari's dusty streets, these children are oblivious to their parents' agonizing decisions over where their future lies, or how an open border a few kilometers away may alter their lives. Yolo David, the newsmakers on the Jordan-Syrian border.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a former advisor to the U.S. Defense Department on Middle East issues and now a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. In Doha, we have Fadl Abdelghani. He's the founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. And in London, we have Ammar Waqaf, the founder and director of Gnosis, a think tank focusing on the Middle East. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Fadl, let me start with you. There are those who look at the numbers, and granted, it's not massive numbers, but they look at the numbers of Syrians returning home from places like Jordan, and they say, well, if it's good enough for the refugees to return home, does that tell us that there's peace in the country, or at least there's a process towards peace enough to inspire them to go home?
Actually, the question is how much the percentage. If we are talking about 17,000, there is 1.5 million in Syria. So this is like about 1.1%. So this is only 1%. So who is coming back? The question is, why didn't all come back? Because because we need to go back who is for the reason why those become refugees, why like half the Syrian population transfer to be either IDP or refugees. The main cause is the violation against them, which is amount to be crimes against humanity and war crimes. The shelling, the extrajudicial killing, the sexual violence, those are throwing the barrel bombs against them, destroying their houses and shops. Those are mainly committed by Assad regime that lead those people to be refugees.
Right.
This cause and root of the problem doesn't solve till now.
Right.
So this is the main issue, that the people doesn't come back. I'm giving you an example now, and this is now statistics about who is back from Jordanian. 70. We in SNHR documented 78 arbitrary arresting cases against, including 8 Jordanian, and 6 of them released after 1 month, including 1 journalist, and 2 still disappeared.
Jasmine, in Lebanon, in Jordan, these countries have had tremendous social upheaval as well with the influx of refugees. It's caused a lot of debate within these societies and so on. Politicians in these countries are saying, okay, it's time to go back home. Is it a safe country to return to?
I think, first of all, kind of differentiating between the situation in Lebanon and the situation in Jordan is really important, because the situation in Jordan is much less inclined to push refugees back into Syria before they're ready. Whereas in Lebanon, because of the massive influx, refugees are 1/4 of the Lebanese population in Lebanon. It's quite a different situation than Jordan. So there's much more pressure on the refugees in Lebanon to go back. In Jordan, it's an interesting case to look at, because the government has said to the refugees, basically, look, we know eventually you're going to have to go back. This isn't really sustainable, but don't go back before you're ready. So there's less pressure on them. And so that, so in that sense, if you look at the refugees in Jordan and look at how few of them are going back, it really does tell you that there are very real reasons and very grave concerns on the part of these refugees that are preventing them from going back. So I just want to state one quick statistic to demonstrate this. So UNHCR, which is responsible for refugee affairs in the region, does these intention surveys every few months where they go and they ask refugees about their intentions to return, why they want to return, why they don't want to return. In Jordan, where there's not much pressure on them to return, 66% have said to UNHCR that they want to return back home one day, but 78% have no plans to do so in the next 12 months. So that should tell you that even though they want to go home and they don't feel pressured, they still don't feel like the time is right. And we can go into the reasons why later.
Ammar Wakaf, it's not a safe country to return to. And as Fadil said, you go back and you could be picked up and, I don't know, end up in prison as well. This is not a good time for Syrian refugees to go back home. What do you think?
Well, to the contrary, I think, we're yet to hear of a trend of detaining people who have come back from the outside. We understand that tens of thousands have done so from Lebanon, and probably up to 17,000 have done so from Jordan. These are the registered ones. There are others, many others, who are simply not registered with UNHCR, who chose to get out of the country when things went south, and they found some work permit in Lebanon, Jordan and other areas, and they decided to come back. You can add to that also the internally displaced people. If you take the example, for example, of Aleppo, up to 1.5 million internally displaced refugees went back from the coastal area to Aleppo after it went back to government control. We hear of no problems at all. Problem is that certain places are so devastated that it's not easy for people to come back, and there is shortage of manpower to do some reconstruction, and obviously there are shortages in funding and so on. But at the end of the day, there are more underlying issues why people don't want to go back. Mainly and chiefly is the military service. And you can distinguish between for example, a younger generation who want or do not want to go to military service, and older generation who will go back as reservists.
Okay, so let me come in here.
And who have families to feed.
Yeah, okay. So Fadil, address this point, right? So we have Ammar giving the example saying once Assad's government took control of Aleppo again, you can follow the traffic and you can see that people returned. It suggests that people found it safe enough to return to. Address that.
I don't believe in Assad government, first of all. I believe what the Commission of Inquiry said, the investigation committee of the Syria, which is issued their recent report past month in second recommendation, and everyone can see that it's available in Arabic and in English. In their recent report, mentioned very clearly that the situation in Syria forbidden and still unsuitable to the refugees or to the IDP to go back. That's very clear. After they document and after they recorded several types of violation against the civilians in Syria. This is the first point. The second point is that why this regime and his followers also want this propaganda. The regime, who is the one who displaced those? Who is the one who throw the barrel bombs against them? This propaganda actually serves the regime narrative that the refugees start be back, and so that you need to actually back again and start dealing with me politically and start the reconstruction. Everything is okay. That's actually the regime message. The regime doesn't care at all.
Okay, so let me get it.
And that's very clear on his tongue. Actually, Jamil Hassan mentioned that clearly.
Okay, so let me.
It's available on YouTube.
Fadil, let me do this. Allow me to do this. I'm gonna get an addition from Jasmine, and then I'm gonna get Ammar to respond. Jasmine, do you believe that the Syrian regime, and I guess we can add to that perhaps the Russians as well, are creating a narrative to make it seem as if things are winding down, people can come home?
Without a doubt. The Syrian regime wants everybody to know that the war is over, that they've won, and that it's time for people to come back. Because if it's time for people to come back, that also means that it's time for reconstruction money to flow in. It's time for embassies to open up for countries to open up their embassies and normalize relations with the regime. And it also allows the Russians to claim that the person that they are backing and were backing has won. So there's a very clear narrative, and you can see that in the way that the Russians inflate the number of returnees from the real numbers. So if you look at, and I just want to respectfully disagree with Ammar, who says that there have been no cases of people being disappeared or killed or arbitrarily detained or arrested or conscripted when they go back to Syria. There have been plenty of anecdotes and evidence that tells us that people just simply don't know what fate awaits them when they go back to Syria. It makes it impossible for any responsible human being, especially someone who's responsible for the safety of their families, to take their families and go back to a country where they simply don't know what is going to happen to them when they go back.
Right.
There are three reasons. It's not just conscription, as Ammar mentioned. There are three main reasons, according to refugees themselves, why they're not going back to Syria. First, and by far, is the security situation, and that includes conflict, it includes war situation, but it also includes the arbitrary arrests and detentions that I'm talking about. They can't guarantee their safety. The second reason is livelihood and having a job. They just simply can't guarantee that as well. And the third and equally important reason is housing issues and concerns. They don't know if they have a house to go back to, if their house is going to be occupied by someone else, or if they're going to be allowed to live where they originally lived before they were forced to become refugees.
Right. So, Ammar, difficult to disagree with Jasmine?
No, not much really. I mean, the issues she mentioned, I was cut when I started with I was going to those later, but you know, I was only allowed to speak about conscription. But that is an important matter because, again, the reservists especially tell us that you know, unlike younger people, they have families to feed, and you know, securing the livelihood of their families is a major concern, added to the insecurity of being a military soldier in the time of war. But I didn't say there were no cases. I said there is no trend that we can identify. We need to be a little bit practical here. We shouldn't naively assume that everybody who's returning home is returning without an agenda. Some people might have certain affiliations, and it is probably the duty of the Syrian authorities to investigate people who might want to blow up themselves with a suicide belt later on. Indeed, we hear certain incidents of a certain convoy here being attacked, or an ambush here for some Syrian, and this all within Syrian-controlled areas. So the authorities need to be vigilant, and the population inside Syria expects their authorities to be vigilant. And if it is okay for example, German authorities to put some a Syrian warlord or an ex-commander of the Free Syrian Army to trial in Düsseldorf, then we should expect the Syrian authorities to have the same right.
Jasmine?
Yes, probably in Germany they might have a fairer trial, but
So you want to dissect among the refugees. You're not sure of all of them, Jasmine?
Well, I think the rebuttal to that is fairly simple, which is that the Syrian regime actually has to review a list of every refugee that wants to go back to Syria, whether it's from Lebanon or Jordan. The government hands over a list of people who have signed up saying they want to go back, and the Syrian regime gets to review that list, and they get to actually approve or deny people from going back. So we can't really say that they're taking anyone back that they're not aware of, don't know exactly who they are or what they might want to do or what their agendas or affiliations are, as Jamal said, or as Ammar said. They know exactly who's coming back. Sorry if I misspoke his name, but they know exactly who's coming back.
Sorry, on this particular point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I comment on this particular point, please? Because not everyone who's returning to Syria is going through the UNHCR route. Some people are going voluntarily. If you go to the Syrian border, you'd see lots of people, some of them not only tourists, but or people like myself, for example, visiting parents and family, but also people returning back. Again, they are not registered with the UN, and there are no lists. And it could be the case that some arbitrary, as described by your esteemed guest, detentions.
I have one so listen, so Fadil, come in. Listen, I just need to get in here. Both your windows, Ammar and Fadil, are going to drop in 45 seconds, right? So we'll just see color bars. So Fadil, if you want to come in, you have to answer in 20 seconds, please, and that'll be our final answer.
The regime is betraying his allies, actually. So even if the regime accepted some refugees to be back, no one prevent the regime or give protection to any Syrian if the regime decided, or his security forces in any time, under any circumstances, to torture them and to arrest them again. Who give them guarantee from this regime? No one actually said that the state should never review or whatever. But where is the fair trial?
That's a fair point.
The destiny?
And that's at the heart of it all.
82,000 Syrians still disappeared.
And that's why a lot of people don't trust the regime, right? That's at the heart of it. Listen, Jasmine, Fadil, and Ammar, it's been a pleasure. I've got to move on. I thank you for joining us.
I have decided to object to 6 of the 159 articles of the statutory law of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace for reasons of inconvenience, and to invite the Congress of the Republic to discuss them constructively.
It took years for Colombia to negotiate a peace deal with leftist rebels to end decades of war, and the long-awaited agreement earned the president at the time a Nobel Peace Prize. But now his successor, current President Ivan Duque, is trying to make changes to that deal, and thousands of Colombians have been protesting. For instance, Duque opposes the tribunal set up to investigate war crimes. Duque has criticized it for being too lenient on rebel commanders accused of atrocities and says they need tougher sentences. But demonstrators say the president risks damaging the entire peace process. So, is this an attempt to unravel peace in Colombia? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Bogota by Maria Fernanda Cabal. She's a senator with the ruling Democratic Center Party. And we have journalist and writer Richard McCall, who's also the host of the radio show Colombia Calling. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Maria, let me start with you. So, is your president, Ivan Duque, trying to rip up the peace deal?
No. What he is trying is to fit the legislation, because all these 6 objections are confusing how the application is going to be made. For example, let me tell you, in the original act, which is the legislative act, one of these objections say that the FARC, as victimaries, they have to repair the victims. And in the development of this statutory law, it says that the state has to repair the victims. It means the nation. So how come the victims are going to pay for the repair? That's just an action to fit what it says regarding and what was written originally in the peace accord. And one of each of these 6 objections are exactly the same. They are just trying to fit and try to avoid impunity.
Okay, so Richard McCall, what they're saying is they just want to address issues of accountability and justice or lack of justice. They don't want to unravel everything, but they want a proper justice. This is what Duque has been saying, and he said it on the campaign trail, and this is why the majority of Colombians elected him. Isn't that a fair point?
Well, yes, there's certain things that need to be unraveled in that statement. President Duque has a very weak mandate at the moment. He's got a minority in Congress, and so he's looking to appeal to his base and his supporters ahead of the 2019 regional election, so later on this year. Also, he wants to be seen as a president that has a reform agenda, but basically he'll go down as the president who's opposing the peace process. The 6 items that have been brought up for consideration to exclude sexual crimes, to clarify the extradition process, allow simultaneous investigations in Colombia's normal courts, go a long way to undermining an agreement that was signed off and has been in practice for 2 years. Why would anyone, and we're looking at 10,000, more or less 10,000 guerrillas who have agreed to go before the tribunal and 2,000 members of the military. If sentencing provisions are increased, why would they want to go before this?
Yeah, and I'm looking at the pictures here, Maria. One of those figures at the front of the march is Senator Lozada, former FARC urban commander, now sits in the Senate. Is that at the heart of it all, that you guys just don't like the fact that former FARC sit in positions of power with impunity?
When we won the plebiscite, President Santos did not recognize that we won, and he just started trying to make some kind of fixing of the original peace accord, but not in the inner that we wanted changing. For example, impunity. For us, it's disgusting to see all these human rights violators speaking in Congress. They don't have any piece of compassion with their victims. They have not tell any truth to anyone.
But
they have not get...
Maria, I'm sorry to interrupt you, right? And this is, and I apologize for being rude, but the point that Richard made, peace has held for 2 years. So there's half a century of war. I mean, 250,000 victims. It was terrible. Even the paramilitaries did terrible things. Santos's deal might not have been perfect, but it's held for 2 years. The FARC gave over their weapons. They don't even have any weapons to pick up if they want to go back to fighting. So hasn't it worked?
That's not true. They didn't even show how they delivered the weapons. We knew that afterwards there were about 700 discoveries by the military of weapons that are hidden. We are the best and the first cocaine grower and exporter, and FARC still had his hands on it. So they are in Congress right now. They are trying to push all what they did with Santos, not with the Colombian state. It was the government who did this peace accord against the majority. Basically, we don't care, finally, if we have to give things up, but we are not, and we do not agree that this violator of human rights gets the impunity and tell everyone outside that this is peace. We have more than 4,000 people in arms again.
Right.
Again, kidnapping, again, drug trafficking. If this is peace, let me tell you that we are going to be, how do you say that, unviable state, unviable
right.
nation.
Richard McCall?
Let's not forget at this moment, of course, the special jurisdiction that President Duque is trying to delay and, of course, starve of its legitimacy has acted as a voice for the ethnic minorities in Colombia that have been disproportionately impacted by decades of conflict. This was an opportunity for them to access a measure of justice. We're talking about the Afro-Colombian communities, we're talking about indigenous communities, farming communities, things that are going on at this moment, democratic protests in favor of peace, in favor of more recognition of their situation as victims. You say they're rising up against this government, as I mentioned previously. And if I can address one thing said by my esteemed colleague, Maria Fernanda Cabal, yes, there are weapons, obviously, in caches hid around the jungles. Remember, the IRA took 7 years before they actually gave all of their details and this logistics for where the weapons were held in. It's a security blanket, unfortunate as it is, but it's a security blanket for every guerrilla group and insurgent group out there. We just need to look at every different conflict resolution, and we can see that it's been done. And this was expected. Now, curiously, changing the subject somewhat, there have been no polls showing President Duque's approval rating since March the 7th. This means that his approvals are likely to be in a dipping. There's bad unemployment. There was a very public reprimand by President Trump. There's a protest that he's not addressing in the southwest of the country, and of course the HEP. So it's a very weak mandate, and I see that this government is diverting the conversation.
Okay, so Maria, are you diverting the conversation because the economy is not doing well, because Colombians are worried about Venezuelan refugees and so on? Is this a convenient diversion? Address that.
The economy is worse day by day because we inherited a horrible government from Juan Manuel Santos. He gave money to everyone. He bought every vote in the Congress because he wanted this peace above anything, because this peace means a lot of business that we're just getting aware. There was a lot of money around leftist NGOs, all the leftist NGOs that are supported also by Europeans from the left, a lot of money that they just trap. They trap the political arguments of minorities. Listen, the best propaganda that Santos government did was saying that the victims were in the inner circle of the peace accord. The victims never wanted peace without justice. And if you see the arguments of the raped little girls that were kidnapped since 10, 11, 12 years, they just want justice. They don't even want money.
Okay, and certainly, and it's beyond the scope of this program to look at the full scale of the victims, from those who suffered at the hands of the Farc, but also those who suffered at the hands of the paramilitaries and so on. We're going to keep a close eye on this and periodically check in on Colombia and the status of the peace process. For now, I have to move on. Maria Fernanda Cabal and Richard McCall, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, we look at the future of Algeria without Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Will the country turn the page with a new president or face more of the same? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.